And in 1955, two things happened. This young man who was a star athlete was actually going to a Jesuit Catholic high school, one of the few integrated schools at the time in St. Louis. Two things happened. First was the murder of Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi, this little hamlet of Money, Mississippi, where a young man, Emmett Till, 14 years old, Henry's age, traveled from Chicago down to Money, Mississippi to visit his uncle, a sharecropper. He talked fresh, as they said, to a white store owner's wife. A couple nights later, the store owner and his brother came into the sharecropper's home, abducted young Till, beat him severely, murdered him, shot him, threw him in the Tallahatchie River, and a fisherman found his body about a week later. Now, Emmett Till would have just vanished into this vast pool of lost souls in Mississippi, of which there were hundreds, thousands by that time. But his mother, Mamie Till, in Chicago, insisted on having an open funeral casket. And the press took notice, for the black press in America, and also finally the mainstream press began to notice. Then there was a trial in Mississippi with 100 reporters attending, and it was the equivalent of social, it was the equivalent of Michael Brown in Ferguson, it was the equivalent of Eric Garner in New York, and the national media attention was the equivalent of social media today. And Henry was rattled beyond belief by the picture of Emmett Till's savaged face that appeared in Jet magazine in 1955. I never heard of Emmett Till growing up in California, white kid in Sacramento, California. I never heard of him until I went to Mississippi. But Henry's entire generation was the Till generation. And Henry, I think, discovered his mission with the murder of Emmett Till, and that accounted for a lot of what he was by the time that I met him. That same year, he was struck by polio. That was the year of a great polio epidemic in the United States. His father, a physician, actually had the Salk vaccine in trial form in his office, but didn't want to use it in his own family. Henry woke up one morning and couldn't move his legs. Came out of the hospital about 2 months later as a quadriplegic, worked his way back, regained the use of his arms and one leg, and walked with a brace the rest of his life. So those two events, those two really traumatic events, when he was a 15-year-old on the verge of a stunning adulthood, his sister told me it was the first time he ever felt the other. It was the first time he ever felt rejected. And I think that informed the rest of his life. He was, he was a mensch. He was a guy that inspired, literally hundreds of particularly young filmmakers that came through his company in Boston, Blackside Incorporated. It's no secret that he tried to make Eyes on the Prize in 1978 for commercial television. He launched it as a giant 26-part series for ABC. It was a complete and utter failure. It was a train wreck, partly because neither Henry Hampton nor anyone else at that time knew how to make large, linked historical documentaries. No one had ever done it. This was years before Ken Burns. This was years before The American Experience. It was years before any of these series that we now take for granted. And Henry, he didn't know what he was doing, okay? So when it was relaunched in 1985, he was wise enough to go to public television, which did not make the ratings demands that commercial television had. He hired a whole bunch of experienced people, and we set off and we spent a couple of years doing it. And then we spent a couple of years after that doing the second part, which is the really tougher, really messy history from 1965 up to through the 80s with the Black Panthers and black nationalism and affirmative action.